here as we might otherwise if the amendment is rejected. You're back.
I would like to yield to the chairman of my subcommittee, Congressman Rush from Chicago.
Thank you. I appreciate the gentlelady's yielding to me. Mr. Chairman and the other members, I want to just add my voice of support and gratitude to the gentleman from New York for his amendment that he introduced and that he withdrew. I am a signer on that amendment, and I do it for a lot of reasons. And I think that this amendment goes to the heart and the guts of what has been plaguing this nation for a long, long time now, and is how to adequately provide medical attention, medical access, medical care to its most impoverished citizens and to all the citizens alike. Mr. Chairman, I am reminded of how I first got involved in this business of public service, and that was during the 60s. And I remember so well when we, along with Dr. Eric Cast, Dr. Quinn Young, and some others, organized a health center, a free health center on the west side of the city of Chicago, where the only provision that people needed to, and only requirement that they needed to have met in order to get first-class care out of this health clinic was that they be sick, and it served as really a lifeboat for those individuals taking care of their needs. Mr. Chairman, I am opposed to this amendment that we are presently entertaining, but I also want to just in closing want to say to my friend Dr. Gingrich, you used Noah's Ark as an example of what of a problem that people face. Well, let me just tell you, to me, a single-player plan is indeed a Noah's Ark, but it's an inclusive Noah's Ark. It's a Noah's Ark that certainly the Creator has made. It's a Noah's Ark, and that is meant to get people through rough and tumultuous times, through a flood. And I want to just let the gentleman know that since the Noah's Ark, most people have found themselves in a quandary, found themselves in a predicament whereby they cannot escape from the flood of healthcare costs, and certainly the single-payer plan that Mr. Weiner has introduced and withdrawn is the way to go. And I just can't wait until we look out the window when we get back and see the rainbow that will come in as a result of Mr. Weiner and other activities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The time has expired. Since we've gone a little longer on our side, Mr. Gingrich, do you want any more time, or are we ready to go to the vote?
Mr. Chairman, we're ready to go to a vote.
Okay. All those in favor of the Gingrich amendment say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. The noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, with that, I'd like a recorded vote.
Okay. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Waxman.
No.
Mr. Waxman, no. Mr. Dingell. Mr. Dingell, no. Mr. Markey. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone, no. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush, no. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo, no. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Stupak, no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel, no. Mr. Green. Mr. Green, no. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette, no. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps, no. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle, no. Ms. Harmon. Ms. Harmon, no. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky, no. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, no. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee, no. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, no. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Weiner, no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, no. Mr. Melanson. Ms. Melanson, aye. Mr. Barrow. Ms. Barrow votes no. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill, no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, no. Mrs. Christensen. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor, no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes, no. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Space. Mr. Space, no. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney, no. Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton, no. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley, no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton, aye. Mr. Hall. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton, aye. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Deal. Mr. Deal, aye. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Shattuck. Mr. Shattuck, aye. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Boyer. Mr. Boyer, aye. Mr. Radonovich. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts, aye. Ms. Bonomack. Ms. Bonomack, aye. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden, aye. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry, aye. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, aye. Mrs. Myrick. Mrs. Myrick, aye. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Murphy, Pennsylvania. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, aye. Ms. Blackburn. Ms. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey, aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise, aye. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Boucher votes no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch votes no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes no. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey votes no. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Gordon, no. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall votes aye. Mr. Radonovich. Mr. Radonovich, aye. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield, aye. Hold on. Mr. Blunt is not recorded, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Blunt votes aye.
Have all members responded to the call of the roll? Any member wish to change his or her vote?
I don't have Christian.
Clerk will tally the vote and announce it. Okay.
Mrs. Christensen is not recorded, Mr. Chairman. Want to vote no? Vote no? Okay. Ms. Christensen votes no.
Will the clerk announce the vote?
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, the ayes were 23, the nays were 35.
23 ayes, 35 noes. The amendment